Okay, I'm seeing no more comments, so we can move on to the next item, which is a great one, something to my heart. Um, Okay,
Dan's favorite item, the first draft review of the FY24 budget. So we're going to turn it over to Treasurer Adewale and Director of Finance Tiffany Lynch. And we have a spacious 2+ hours for this discussion. So.
Thank you, President Clark and E.D. Nevitz. Thank you, governors. We would really appreciate your presence here today and your commitment to this process. One of the most fundamental decisions you will make as a governor is on fiscal policy, is on setting the budget of this organization for the year. If you all remember, for those of you that have been here for some time, we started this process last year. This is the first budget process that we really have a long timeline to enable us to make good decisions. We started out with, planning for the entire year going into the final decision in September. And we started out with budget retreat, and I believe you all are part of that conversation. But what we need from you today is clarity. What we need from you today is to be able to get an idea of, because the budget is a policy document that you have the primary obligations to do for the sake of this organization. We cannot make that decision. The staff cannot make that decision for you. You are going to be able to provide the clarity required. Which direction do you want to take this organization in the next 1 year? Which direction do you want to take it? So because this is so fundamental and so important, we have provided you materials. We have also provided you some questions ahead of time. And I believe, and I want to say thank you to Governor Jordan Couch for providing his input ahead of time, because he couldn't make it. And he said, I need to be able to have a voice in this. And so he responded by email and answering those questions. We're going to be asking you those questions today. For those governors, and I'm nodding to Governor Williams-Roots, who take time to read the materials ahead of time, I want to thank you for your work and all the other governors that have come to me and asked some questions about it. I'm so grateful that you are so invested in this. Now, we're going to be asking you to we're going to be asking for some straw poll as we go through this budget presentation. That is not, you're not voting on the budget. You're just providing input that is going to help us to prepare the budget. That is what this is all means. Now, for Christina, Todd, Tom, and Allison that are coming in as governors-elect, you still have a voice in the process, even though you may not have all the background information from the retreat, from all of, but you also have the materials. And if you want to be part of that, you are welcome to vote in this straw poll, listening to the argument. And if you have any question whatsoever, please feel free to ask us, because at the end of the day, this budget is going to be implemented on your watch. So I want you to feel like you can be part of the process too. And I'm so grateful that all of you, this is really very encouraging that all the governors-elect are present in this meeting. It's not always like that every year. So this means a lot. So having said that, I'm going to yield it back to Director Lynch to start the presentation. And I'm going to be over there to take the straw poll as she presents the budget.
That's great. All right. Thank you, Treasurer Adewale. Good morning, everyone. So the fiscal 24 budget materials begin on page 29, but I want to talk just a bit about what our objectives are for today, since we do have a fair amount of time on the agenda. The objectives are really consistent with sort of where we are in the budget process, or what the budget process looks like. We're going to take a quick look back at where we started, which is the fiscal 24 budget retreat, which happened in March. identify some of the key takeaways from that time together and how that informed the development of the draft budget of the fiscal 24 funds that you see today. And then once we go through that, we'll also talk about the outstanding budget requests that are not included in the version that you see, as well as looking at fiscal projections and license fee information that's updated based on the first draft. And then lastly, as the Governor or Treasurer Awale mentioned, we want to spend some time talking about getting board guidance on some key questions that will help us develop the next draft of the budget. I want to point out that this process that we're going through this year is much more involved and is happening earlier than it has otherwise. Typically, we bring forward a budget in July, first read, and then approval in September. And that's 2 times that the board gets to see the budget in total. This year, it's 3 times. So we're bringing it 1 time earlier, bringing it also with a little more transparency in terms of giving you an idea of what all of the requests are that come across our table internally before we filter it down and present a version so that we can get your input and bring back a draft that is consistent with what the board feels is appropriate as a unit. So going forward, we're going to talk just quickly about the budget retreat. Now, not everybody was at the retreat, but we did talk about a lot of different things. We talked about license fees. We talked about reserves, projections for fiscal 24, budget priorities. There was a lot of different discussion, but we did have some key takeaways. The first was that, the board had set the 2024 license fees last year. They set it as a static amount, same as this year, so $458. And so we knew that going into preparing the fiscal 24 budget. That means that the projections for 2024 reflect a net loss. We have a net loss for 2023 and an additional net loss for 2024. And the general consensus amongst the board members in attendance at the retreat was that they believed it was appropriate that we spend down reserves. We have unrestricted reserves available to use, and that by keeping license fees static, we thought it was appropriate that we'd have a net loss and that we would spend down those reserves. The second takeaway was talking more about the fact that we have a limited resource of funding, right? The primary source for us is license fees. And within that, what are our priorities in spending? What are our budget priorities? And we kind of distilled it down to 3 main areas. Funding for future WSBA facilities. So WSBA has an office space lease at Puget Sound Plaza in downtown Seattle. Our lease is up at the end of December 2026. And so there's a lot of planning that needs to go into place to ensure that we have funds available if any change in our location or space needs to happen at the end of our lease term. Second is ensuring license fee stability. So the question there was, do we feel like it's a priority that license fees remain flat in 2025 and 2026, so stay the same? And the third was, do we feel it's a priority to invest in current and future programming? So adding more funds to expand our current programming, or we talked a lot about a lot of different items that are coming down the pipeline that we know about that are going to have a fiscal impact. We don't know what the dollar amount is going to be. We know it will have an impact on us to support that work. And then there's also the idea of, what are we not doing that we want to be doing that may not be on the horizon right now? So lots of conversation around that. So we asked the board members in attendance to prioritize those 3 items and give us an idea of where they landed. And so the primary priority, number 1, was facilities, making sure we had funds available to make a move for facilities if necessary. The second was programs, investing in current future programming. And then the third was license fee stability. I'll just note that this was based on where we were at the time. The budget had not been developed yet. It's just a general idea of where people were in terms of where they thought spending needed to occur. The additional feedback we got from the board at the retreat was that it was important that, we brought forward a status quo budget that supported existing programs and services at existing service levels, but also that we would be, it would be important for us to think about any new items that would be needed to increase effectiveness, capacity, efficiency, and innovation within the organization. And so we went back to the drawing board. We started the budget process internally. We got all of the feedback from our staff, our budget managers. They are all, liaisons to the various boards and WSBA's entities to make sure that we collected the requests collectively in the budget process. So what we're presenting in the first draft of the budget shows a status quo budget, which is doing what we're doing right now, programs and services as they are with the existing service levels. There is additionally, there's outstanding requests that show all of the requests, not filtered down like we have in the past where we have looked at everything and said, okay, this is what we're bringing forward to the board. What you see here is all of the requests that have come forward so that you have a sense of what it is that we're considering. They're not currently in the budget, but they're for consideration and for, your input so that we understand where you, how you feel about those particular items. So the draft budget that starts, like I said, the memo's on page 29. It's a pretty lengthy memo and quite, yes.
Dr. Williams-Root said it's not on his page 29. Governor Williams-Root, is it not page 29 on your materials?
I'm not seeing it on page 29. There's one that I opened on the website. That's the 388 page. My page 29 is.
It should be 333. It should be 333. 333 pages.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it said. So my PDF is 388 pages that I downloaded from the FAR website this morning.
Ooh,
So.
interesting.
Will you check again and see if the materials, I think it's titled, what was the title?
There's a link in the chat. It'll take you to the correct material. Having the Governor Day posted. I'm seeing it's on page 29 on that one.
It is or is not?
Yeah, it is. 29.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. Okay.
Are you?
All right.
Okay. So the draft budget is presented with the general fund, CLE, and client protection fund. The sections fund and the capital budget will be presented in the August materials. The sections are still currently working on their budgets. They'll be submitting them in July. So in the budget memo is a couple of pages. I think I'm going to refer to the page numbers and hope that I'm correct. The pages 30, I think it's 35 and 36 maybe, that actually have a detailed list of all the changes between fiscal 23 and fiscal 24. They're considered significant. So we use like a dollar amount of $20,000 or more in changes. And so if you are curious about all of those details, that is in the memo, but we're going to talk really high level here about the main changes to each of the funds. So first and foremost, the general fund is our operating fund, has the majority of our activities. It's funded by license fees, 39 cost centers, and the majority of our FTEs at 130.7 FTEs. Our total FTEs for the budget is 141.5 for the organization. So the fiscal 24 budget assumes a loss of 1.1 million, which is a $546,000 increase from fiscal 23. And it's comprised of two different things. One is revenue. There is an increase in revenue of 392,000. It's really minimal. And again, like we said, the license fee is remaining static, so there's no increase in fees. That is the primary source of revenue. But we do also typically have an increase in our membership each year. So the net number of members increases each year. One thing I want to note, though, is that historically that has been about a 2% increase, anywhere from 600 to 700 people. In 2022, we had data that showed it had reduced, but weren't sure if it was an anomaly given COVID and all the things that were happening with membership data at that time. But for 23, now that we've finished the 2023 renewal process, we see a similar pattern for 2023, which means that the total number of memberships increasing each year is reducing. And that's not a surprise, I would say, given that our conversations we've had about our demographics and the likelihood that that will decrease over time as the number of people exiting is going to be greater than the number of people incoming and being licensed. And so this is identifying that there is a second year of a pattern. Now there's a pattern. And so we've adjusted our projections to assume a lower number of net increases in memberships. And then we'll continue to keep an eye on that. So that is one significant change in our projections. Additionally, for revenue in fiscal 23, we budgeted quite low for interest income. I think, when we were preparing the budget, it was in 2022. Well, interest rates were non-existent at the time, and so it was very conservative. But now that interest rates are higher, we have a lot of investments in, CDs that last 12 months or, more. And so we've got a better sense of what that interest will be. So that has also increased our revenue. In terms of expenses for the general fund, most of our expenses are staffing related. And so the bulk of the increase is in indirect expenses, and particularly in salaries and benefits and taxes. So we'll go through that in detail in the next slide, but that's the bulk of it. Direct expenses hasn't had a huge change. Yes, President.
Thank you, and okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you. So the entire time that I've been on the board, and one of my major concerns with the presentation is looking at the last financials, we're over 2 million above what the projection is for this year, right? So your projections, not just yours, but I mean, historically, the bars have been materially off every year. So I'm concerned that the numbers that we're basing a decision on don't really reflect what they end up being. Is that a fair thing to?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So I will note, first of all, right now, the financials show a net income of, I think, over $2 million, like you mentioned. But with WSBA's financials, we are cyclical. So we collect all of our money at the beginning of the year. Our activities and our expenses tend to be, at least in the direct expense era, is in the latter half of the year. So you'll see things kind of pick up and that income drop. So if you look at the timeline over the year, I'm not saying that that what you're saying is incorrect. I do agree that we outperform our budget every year. That's not disputed whatsoever. And I think that we have consciously made a choice not to change our budgeting process. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning of the year. Is do we need to refine a little tighter? What I will say about this year, what is different about this year, is when you look at the actual year-to-date expenses for salary, probably the closest we've come to being on budget with salary. We're at 65, almost 66% of the year for indirect expenses actual compared to the budget, which is 66%. Net, it's about $100,000 in salary of a $25 million budget. That's incredibly close. It's probably the closest I've seen it. The reason is because our budget this year is so specifically tied to individuals. We budgeted for every person, and we have a comp structure that identifies exactly what those steps are and the movement in those steps. It's different than having a salary pool that we can work with and move in between. That leaves more room for variability. The other thing is that this year, one of the biggest ticket items that was off was interest income. We are making a lot of money on interest income that was not budgeted. Without that, I think our budget, it would look different. So there are a lot of different factors, and I don't disagree with you, but this year feels a bit different to me in that we are a lot closer on the indirect side. Indirects is usually where we come out to the good. We budget assuming we are fully staffed, and we are never fully staffed. So there's always wiggle room there. We do account for some of it. There's a line item in our financials that says allowance for open positions. It's $200,000. We assume that we're not going to be fully staffed the whole year. And in some years, in years during COVID or other years where there's more staff turnover, it takes longer for us to fill positions. And that has been very challenging over the past couple of years specifically. We're not going to hit our budget for those expenses. Additionally, the other area that we typically have more than budget is revenue, license fees specifically. We've typically outperformed. This year, looking at, we've collected the majority of our fees so far. We still have a portion of funds that will come in for new admittees in the next few months. We are crossing our fingers that we're going to hit budget. That's not what we've been in the past. We've always been ahead of budget. So again, these are all just different signals to me that I've not seen in the past. And so that's why I'm a little more conservative about how we approach this. And in the rest of the slides that we'll talk about, we do show worst case scenario, because it's important that you know that if we did actually spend the budget and did have people hired the entire year, what the impact would be. But there is an offset and built in to say, okay, we beat the budget every year. What's the estimate if we beat the budget on average And what does that look like? What is the action? What is our more realistic, fund balance going to be instead of the worst case scenario? So trying to reflect that in our presentation is part of the goal. We're not going to be able to be right, but I would say those are my thoughts about this year particularly. That gives me a little bit of pause about history.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Thank you. Okay, this one.
Okay. All right.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So, Tiffany, when you were talking about on our revenue side, it's the driver is our license fees. And then you mentioned on the other side that there seems to be more people leaving. And I was curious if you knew the proportion of leaving because of becoming inactive, leaving because of just completely leaving and leaving because of death. I mean, do we know, what's in that pie of leavers? And we may not know, but I just wonder.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have not dug into the particular reasons, but I will note that it's not going inactive. It is no longer a member of the Bar Association.
And to add to that, it is a known fact that baby boomers are retired en masse. And as I'm looking at Perry and others at the STARS committee, that has been the crisis that we have had in our state with our inability to be able to replace baby boomers that are retiring with new admittees, especially in areas where we have challenges. So yes, you're right. There is a retirement boom of people just declining to be part of the profession. They are moving on due to the pandemic and health care and all of that. They are done, and they are not even putting themselves on any other stopgap measure. They are shutting down their offices and moving on. And that's why we have a crisis in those areas, legal deserts. Thank you for the question. All right.
Okay.
Okay,
Sorry.
Todd and Tom. Todd first.
Yeah, so and maybe I'm conflating these two. On the general fund slide we have up there, it shows 130.73 FTEs, but I thought the earlier reference was to 140.5. This is just because this is a general fund only and not the CPF.
Yep,
Is that correct?
NCLE.
And then a second quick question related to a reference that to tax expense. And I just wanted to kind of clarify, there was some discussion yesterday with regards to the organization not even filing 990s, and it's not a comment. I mean, unless you had UBI, I don't think you have any tax anyway, right?
Correct.
So, and I kind of mulling it over, assume that this tax expense relates predominantly to payroll taxes, FICA? Okay.
Yes.
Is the organization exempt from other use taxes and property taxes and things of that nature as well? Just out of curiosity.
No, so we do for all of the CLE specific items. So when we sell products, we do collect sales tax and we remit it to the state. So we do have some pieces of our business that are tax related. So the answer is yes to that in terms of specifically. We do pay real estate excise tax, and so that is included in our rent line item in our budget. So
Right.
we do have that as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
Tom?
Okay, so the anti-bow wave, do we have data on how many of our members are in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, we do.
Thanks.
And you can request for that information from E.D. Nevitz. Governor Williams-Root.
So thank you to Governor-elect Ahern, because that was one of the things I just wanted to say is looking at the executive director's report, it's always the demographic information we have is always her last page. It's one of my favorite reports. And just to state as a fact, 7,500 active members are ages 60 and above. And between the ages of 21 and 30, there's 1,600. So I appreciate that conversation because that's something I'm thinking about and looking at and saying, and again, I'm not doing all, just the active license fees. We have 7,500 active members who are 61 age 61 and over. So.
Thank
And
you.
I'll just quickly throw in that following up on that diversity inclusion stuff we were talking about yesterday, I mean, we need to fill our ranks. And that's another reason why that's really important. And we need to be, my thought is we need to focus on the folks who aren't joining the profession. And that's why I also am excited about the apprenticeship, or I don't know what the formal title is, as opposed to law school approach for entry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And like we said yesterday, the question of why is very important. All right. Director Lynch.
Okay, great. Okay, we're going to move on to just breaking down the indirect expenses. That is the largest increase. I wanted to highlight this. So as I said, indirect expenses include salaries, benefits, and other indirect expenses. The majority of the increase is in the staffing cost. So we have, as I mentioned, a compensation schedule. Each of the assumption in the budget is that each of the eligible employees, which is the majority, all of our employees, are eligible for their movement in the steps. There's a specific percentage increase identified with each of those steps. And so the budget is very specific, identifies every employee and their movement in their step, depending upon what grade that they're in. Additionally, there's funds available for promotions, mid-year market adjustments that are needed, and a possible performance incentive plan. And then we always have temporary employees every single year. Usually it's tied to our licensing season. So we always have a lot of need for additional staff during that time. We also have interns and things of that nature. So the budget increase related to temporary employees is actually primarily just a rate increase for those individuals. And then lastly, capital labor. So capital labor is related to our software development for our IT staff. Our IT staff do develop specific software programs for internally, and that work that they do can be capitalized and expensed over the life of the asset. And so when there is a significant amount of labor that's used, it's an offset to salaries. It makes salaries less in the given year. Fiscal 23 is an incredibly high development year. We have two very big projects that have been in the works for practically the whole year, even from last year. One is the mandatory continuing legal education database and system, as well as the discipline system database. So those two are still in progress, and they are planned to complete development at the beginning of fiscal 24. And then the IT team will be transitioning to some smaller projects, but not to the same level of development as fiscal 23. So that's why that is decreasing. Employment and payroll type taxes like the FICA, the unemployment insurance, Washington Family Medical Leave, those are ones that have different rates that we've updated. Our two largest benefit costs are our healthcare costs and retirement. Healthcare, we will get those rates in August usually, but we've put a placeholder of a 4% increase in our employer contribution for that. That's about similar. It hasn't actually, those costs haven't increased significantly over the past couple of years, but we have to be prepared in case they do. Retirement is tied to compensation. So as the compensation increases, the retirement amount will increase. We are part of the Department of Retirement Systems, and they set their rates for a July to June period. So when the materials went out, we didn't have that information yet, but we did receive that last week. The rate itself, we budgeted to remain the same based on the information from the Office of the State Actuary. But luckily enough, they have come in and said they're reducing the rate for employer contribution by 1%, which is significant. So the next draft of the budget will include the update for the new rate. The current rate is 10.39%. So for every dollar, it's 10.39% that we have to contribute to retirement. It's 9.39% for next year. So it's over $100,000 in savings that we're going to see based on that change alone. Yeah. Oh, sure. No, thank you. I don't want to break it. Okay. And then lastly, other indirect expenses. That's kind of the catch-all for things like rent, supplies, depreciation, insurance, all of those types of business type expenses. We haven't had a huge change in that. One area that we do know will increase likely is the professional or our liability insurance, which tends to increase each year. We just finished the application process, so we should have that a little more idea of what that increase will be as we move through the budget process in the coming months. All right. So the CLE fund has 3 cost centers and is for CLE products, seminars, and desk books, and equates to about 9.5 FTE that support the CLE department. The budget for fiscal 24 has a net income of almost 142,000, which is still a little bit less than last year, but still a net income, which helps to add to their reserves to support any future needs that they might have for the actual CLE development. In this case, for the change in fiscal year to fiscal 23 to 24, the main change is going to be related to desk books, royalties, and seminar registration. So that's the primary revenue. But just keep in mind that their revenue is tied to what their schedule is going to be. So whether that's a production schedule for desk books, depending each year can vary. And then seminars relatively remain similar, but depending upon what demand looks like and what registrations look like in the current year, that can be adjusted. And typically speaking, if we have less revenue, then we're going to have less expense to produce said items for the products and for seminars as well. But there is an increase in indirect expenses, like I just mentioned. The Client Protection Fund is showing, again, 1 cost center, 1.23 FTE that support it. And there is revenue is mainly the assessments for client protection, currently is at $20. Last year, the board approved a 1-year reduction to that assessment from $20 to $15. So the $5 difference is the reason for the reduction in revenue and thus resulting in a net loss for next year. However, the fund balance, as you can see, it currently is over $4 million. It's a healthy fund balance. The budget for the main expense for this particular fund is the gifts to the injured clients, and that is budgeted about $500,000 annually. It usually lives within there, but it can be more. But we feel like it's sufficient. The budget and the fund balance is sufficient to support the needs of the fund in 2024. Okay. So again, that's status quo, existing programs and services at existing service levels. So what's next here is the items that were submitted as outstanding. We have not included them in the budget. In the memo itself, it breaks them out into different categories than reflected here. We broke it out by internal operations type requests and other funding requests. But what I thought would be helpful is for you to understand of these requests, which ones actually have a long-term effect on our finances, right? What have recurring costs? If you make a decision about these, there is a bow wave, right? Every year beyond this, you are committing to a certain level of spending. And then the one-time costs are not necessarily 1-year costs, but, related to a specific project or an event. And so there's not an ongoing commitment from a funding perspective for those items. For our staffing needs, we internally looked at a variety of different things. One is what do we need in order to maintain existing programs and services at existing service levels? There are certain areas that we have that have increased in workload, and therefore we are not meeting not meeting the needs that we currently have or meeting the service level that we currently expect to do or to perform in. Then there's also the question of if we had more capacity and we could do more, what would we do and what would we need to do that? So that's the sort of the span of what we considered when we thought about staffing needs. And there were a lot of 5 main areas that we had identified for staffing needs. The first was in event planning and executive administration support. The second was mandatory continuing legal education. Third is in information technologies, particularly in network operations. And then support for the Council on Public Defense. Member resources related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and public outreach. So those were the general areas in which the staffing needs were identified. I'll note that the outstanding budget requests in detail start on page 33 of your materials. Second is staffing and professional development and training. So in the budget, I want to preface this with, there's already budgeted funds included in the first draft of the budget for professional development conferences and staff training. So it's not that there isn't anything in the budget. What's identified as an outstanding budget request is additional funding for that. Now, WSBA, as many governors do know, you attend different conferences that are really specific to bar associations or the type of work that we do. There's unique events and conferences that we attend that are specific to our work. And so not only do you have normal skills building, technical items, learning, you also have the need to attend some of these events and conferences held by organizations where we need to have an organizational presence on a national level. It's good for networking, creating a cohort. There's a lot of times when folks need to reach out to their peers in different states for a variety of different things. It's good for innovation, all kinds of things. So we do have probably, when you think about staff development and training for a standard organization, we probably have a very different approach to that because we have all these organizations that we do want to have a presence with. And so that leads to a larger budget, generally speaking, than say, your standard continuing education type of training. What we're doing internally right now is we've gotten a lot more requests than, we can't do everything. We can't go to every conference. We can't afford to send everybody to every conference. And so we're working on an internal conference philosophy with the executive team to really run through all these requests to see if it fits within what we think is necessary for us to attend. Does it mean that we have to go in person? Can we go every other year? How many people really need to go to these? How do we share that information? And so it's really more internally, we're working on figuring out what that need is, but that is an outstanding request. The third is Moderate Means Program. This is a program that is housed at all 3 law schools. This particular request is routine. Annually, they come to us to request additional funding. It's tied to the fact that they're staffing at each one of those law schools and that they too are looking for increase in compensation and costs of living, et cetera. So that's a pretty standard request from year to year. Third is the Chief Hearing Officer. That particular one is related to our contract with the Chief Hearing Officer. Governor Williams-Ruth provided a memo that's in the materials as well that talks about the request. The contract itself has not changed in the dollar value since 2011. And so that is kind of the core of it. But if you would like more information, that's page 34. And then lastly, the bar examiner fees. So the Board of Bar Examiners is responsible for exam grading, and they receive a stipend for the exams that they grade. The exam stipend has not changed since 2013 when we moved to the uniform bar exam. And so the request is to increase the stipend. And I think the Board of Bar Examiners has had some struggles with recruitment. And so the hope is that by increasing the stipend for the exam grading, that might help. But that's the request for the recurring costs for the bar examiners. In terms of one-time costs, there's a handful of those as well. Cloud infrastructure implementation is a request through our IT department. Currently, we have our network infrastructure that's on premises. And so as we've moved towards a more hybrid work environment, a lot of remote workers, in order to, fix certain things. If there's something that is happening internally, we need people to show up in person at the office. So ideally, we are talking to vendors, thinking about what it is that we need to do, what's most advantageous for WSBA in terms of moving things to a cloud-based infrastructure. It might not be all of our infrastructure, but at least some parts of it. And then also for business recovery. I think that if the building itself was not able to be accessed, we want the ability to be able to deal with our infrastructure remotely. And that's what the cloud infrastructure would help with. So we are refining that number. It's a new request. We're still getting a lot of information on it, but that is one outstanding item. Second is the document scanning project. So as I mentioned before, WSBA's lease is up at the end of 2026. And with remote work has changed the amount of people that are actually in the office. We have 3.5, almost 4 floors in Puget Sound Plaza. We're currently in the process of consolidating the space. So we're actually really only on 2 floors now out of the 3.5, but we have a lot of paper documents, in all these file rooms. We also have a lot of documents held offsite that can all be made electronic. And so the project is focused on a concerted effort to bring in a bunch of temps to scan all of our documents, get them all ready, and get rid of the paper documents in anticipation for, not needing all that extra space, and of course not paying for offsite storage as well. The third is the DI Council's pipeline to the Profession Summit. The request is funding to provide a summit. And I think that there is a lot of work that the DI Council in their charter identifies creating space for looking at ways for those that are underrepresented to enter into the profession. And so this summit the idea is to bring people together to figure out how to advance WSBA's goals in that vein. And then the fourth is small town and rural committee outreach and activities. There's a number of different work, the amount of different work that is related to this particular request. One is that it's not new. Currently the STAR committee is doing outreach and job fairs. It is requesting an increase in funding for that work, but it's also asking for funds to create a pipeline placement program, as well as a stakeholder summit. So that's kind of the summary of those.
I think Nancy has a question.
Yeah.
Thanks. I didn't expect a response quite that quickly, but two things, Tiffany, on the comparison on the membership. The comparison always seems to be between the lower end of the list, which is lawyers ages 21 to 30, and us oldsters that are slightly in a higher category. And I'm not sure that's an accurate way to compare it, since very few of us, if any of us, graduated from law school and passed the bar when we were 21, 22. So I think that's a skewed figure to look at. And if you look at the next category, which is 31 to 40, it's more accurate. And in that instance, it does not seem that the people that are dropping off in the older years, maybe I shouldn't use the word dropping off, but the lawyers that are leaving the profession in the older years is actually less than the lawyers present in the younger years. And doing a comparison with active lawyers, if we look at how many years they've been in practice, there's many more people in those younger years in practice than in the older years. So it may be that while our demographics are very interesting, I agree with Brent, I love looking at them. I think maybe we need some other line items that would be a more accurate predictor of future license revenues. And then looking at the list of requested funding that you just went through, I'm concerned about how that might change the per member charge in future years. And if that calculation hasn't been made, I think maybe we should have that before any final decision is made on the budget. Because I've been concerned, I've mentioned this before, that the couple of $1 million of extra revenue that comes in over the last couple of years, the sections have not benefited from that. We continue to pay a per member charge based on, what seems to be a lesser amount of revenue. So I would hate for the per member charge to increase for section members while the Bar Association reserves increases without any benefit to us. So thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. I will note that the Budget and Audit Committee did approve the per member charge for 2024, but in approving the per member charge, one of the other tasks that we are, tasked with in the next year is re-looking at our policy for the calculation of the per member charge. So it's not necessarily answering, or I recognize what you're saying absolutely and how these decisions will impact the per member charge. But I wanted to just remind or put it out there to folks that it is part of our work plan for next year to really look at how we calculate it and does it still make sense? Is it appropriate?
And I'd be happy to be one of a couple section members to help with that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you have something? to say?
No.
No. Okay. 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 Are there, and I know that there are some folks who might have more information about certain items on this list. I open this up for just a few minutes if you have anything that you want to add. Otherwise, we'll just keep moving through, as I know we want to stay on time and make sure that we have time to get all of that board feedback.
We're gonna try as much as possible to take a break at 10:30 so that you can come back and then we can dwell into the questions on the program direction. Okay?
Okay. So with the first draft of the budget, we've updated the fiscal projections and information about license fees. I'm going to hit the high levels here, but it is in your materials. The particular assumptions, I believe, are on pages. Sorry about that. 36. But high level, we talked about already the assumption that, revenue, overall revenue is increasing by 1% annually. We expect this assumes that we are not changing license fees. So this is assuming that license fees is the same at 458 through 2026. It assumes that there's no change to staffing levels. And then a key piece is that our overall compensation structure will have a 2% merit or 2% increase to the market, the midpoint in the market in 2025 only. As I mentioned earlier, when we, based on President Clark's comment about us outperforming our budget. What's presented here is worst case scenario in the net income or loss column, but we have outperformed our budget every year, at least for the past 10 years. It doesn't mean that we have a net income every year. It means that we outperform the budget. So if we had a loss, we just had less of a loss, for example. So we needed to use less of our reserves. There's a lot of reasons why that happens. I alluded to some of them, but I do think over the past couple of years, the pandemic did have an impact on the reality of spending, right? We just did not have things in person. Our direct expenses came in far under what our budget was, but we also had to be prepared in the years where, especially in 2022, I would say is a good example. We kind of thought we would be coming back and it just didn't happen like we thought it was going to. That all being said, what's presented here is kind of that range, worst case scenario, and then say on average, we beat our budget by $600,000. What would that look like? What would our net income look like? What would our reserves look like? And so what this chart represents is an anticipation of, okay, for 2025 or 2024, we're good. We still have an appropriate level of unrestricted reserves. I will mention that this is only unrestricted reserves. This is not the facilities reserve or the operating reserves. Those are still intact. It doesn't touch any of that. So this is only what's available to be used to support operations. And so for 2025, if we were to keep the fees at 458, we'd still have a sufficient amount of unrestricted reserves. If we hit our budget, we'd get pretty close, down to 296,000. But it could be anywhere from that to a higher amount, say 2.1 million. It does reflect that, again, worst case scenario, and, some degree, maybe more realistically in 2026, it may mean that we either have to raise license fees or cut down expenses. And so that's why looking at a 24 budget has long range effects, right? It's a bow wave. So if it means that we're going to have to cut expenses in 26, we may choose a different approach or a measured approach for 2024. I see, I'm sorry, I can't keep track of this, but there's a hand up.
Todd Bloom, you still have a question?
No, I kind of sorted it out. So the 600,000, just to be clear, is a placeholder or approximation of what we think if we overperform, i.e. have more revenue or less expense by that amount. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yes, President Clark.
Thank you so much. Would there be a way for the next version of the budget to have a projection if the board did decide to reduce their lease? What that.
Yes.
We.
Yes,
we're
it's
definitely-
actually in the question, so
Thank you.
you're on it. That's
Yep.
great.
I'm gonna post the question during the break so that everyone will be able to,
Put it in the chat.
yeah,
So-
I'll put it in.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right, and then the board will need to make a decision about 2025 license fees this September. And so this next slide is just to give you a sense of what, the projections include, which is a flat license fee. It gives you some history about what the license fee has been. But there's a column called effective license fee, and that really is the fee that we would have to charge if we did not have reserves to rely on. So what does it really take? What would we have to charge our members to break even on the budget, assuming the budget comes true, right? So for 2023, our budgeted loss of $562,000 means that we would have had to charge $475 for a license fee. That is about 3.5% more than our existing license fee. But I'm really confident that we are going to beat that budget this year again. I think at least break even is a realistic expectation. If not, we might come in ahead of that. But if that was the case, if we broke even, it means that $458 was the right fee to charge because that's what it costs us to run the organization. So in years where we have a net income, it means that the fee should be lower. In years where we have a net loss, it means the fee needs to be higher. So this just gives you a sense of what the fee could be or may need to be if we hit certain marks of the budget. So anywhere from, $475 to or $457 to $537, but that just gives you the range and idea of what that looks like. Okay, I think we want to take a break or
Oh.
answer questions first, but
Governor Katie?
$37.
37?
Yeah. Mhm. I mean, no, because the 409 is based on the fact that we had $1.6 million in net income. And so it's unusual, except for the fact that a couple different things. One is 2022, our budget assumed a lot more in-person work than actually happened. So we had budgeted for meetings, a lot of direct expenses that did not come to fruition. So there were a lot of savings there. So that was part of it. And then we did have more revenue than anticipated as well. So again, I agree that we typically outperform our budget, and that is a significant swing. And so when you look at the effective license fee, if you were to look at the $600 offset, that's probably more realistic than the worst case scenario. Mhm. Yeah, and so what I will say is if you look at 2014, and if you look at the full range, right, you see that we were spending down our reserves because we had the license fee rate of $325 that was required, that was, part of the referendum at the time. So we spent down our reserves, even though for those years we needed to actually charge a certain dollar amount. So it's almost kind of like a slow switch of the two, right? We've spent down our reserves and now we're building them back up. But yeah, we've outperformed. There's no question about that. I do think that it's the reality of our budgeting philosophy and how we budget. And the likelihood that, we tend to be really conservative. That's the truth.
All right.
I just want to add something really quick. And again, these are projections. So, we really don't know often, but I think one of the trends that we're seeing is that expenses do rise every year. Salary, most especially, but also rent and all these other things rise. And historically, we've made up for a big amount of that gap because our membership was growing. And so the trend we see is that we won't necessarily be able to count on a growth in membership to make up the growth in expenses. So that's just one of the trends that we're projecting. We have 2 years where we've seen that, but so again, it's a projection, but that's sort of part of what we're anticipating.
So, okay, what I would add to that is that the prior boards that I've been on, the reason that we had as a boards, those past boards were to build reserves because we wanted the fee to be flat. And that was something that the boards had done. So that's partly why you see these gains. In 2019, we told you, Tara, that we wanted to be lean and mean fighting machine kind of thing. That was the kind of the mindset, right? So that was prior boards. That's not now. I mean, if you guys don't want to, I'm still do that, but that's why, the A's are there. So thank you.